Hey, welcome back to Compounding Quietly. Rebalancing sounds like discipline, but most investors who rebalance often aren't being disciplined. They're reacting. That's a harder distinction than it sounds, and it matters more than most people realize. Let's think through it together. Every few months, something moves in the market. A position grows larger than you intended. A sector runs well ahead of everything else. And the instinct most investors have is immediate fix-it. Trim the winner, add to the laggard, get back to the original percentages. It feels productive. It feels like you're doing the right thing. But what's actually happening in a lot of those moments is something different. The portfolio didn't drift into a dangerous place. The investor drifted into an uncomfortable feeling, and rebalancing became the action they reached for, because doing something felt better than doing nothing. That's not a small distinction. If the trigger is discomfort rather than a defined condition, the math stops working the way you think it does. Most investors were taught early that rebalancing is a core discipline, and in the right context, it absolutely is. But the version that gets practiced most often is the reactive kind, the kind that happens after a sharp move, after a bad quarter, or after a conversation that made you second-guess your whole allocation. That kind of rebalancing doesn't manage risk, it manages anxiety, and those are not the same thing. Here's the sharper version of the problem. Frequent rebalancing, when it's driven by emotion, interrupts the one process you actually need to protect compounding. Every time you trim a position that has grown, you remove units. You remove the base that was about to generate the next layer of growth. If you're doing that on a schedule, or on a feeling you're not managing your portfolio, you're managing your discomfort at the cost of your returns. Before you rebalance, there's one question that matters more than the others. What is the specific condition, not the feeling, the condition that should trigger a change? If you don't have a clear answer to that, what you're doing isn't a strategy, it's a reflex. Rebalancing at its core is designed to do one thing. It's designed to keep your portfolio aligned with your actual risk tolerance as your life situation changes, not as the market changes as your situation changes. That distinction is important. A market move on its own doesn't necessarily change your risk profile. What changes your risk profile is a change in your income need, your time, horizon, or your capacity to absorb loss. If none of those have changed, a position that grew larger is not a problem. It's a result. Here's what a meaningful rebalance actually looks like. Imagine you started with 60% in broad equities and 40% in income-generating positions. After a strong equity run, that shifts to 70% equities and 30% income. If your income need hasn't arrived and your time horizon hasn't shortened, there is no functional case for rebalancing yet. The drift is real, but the risk shift may not be significant enough to act on. Now, imagine the same investor, but in year 3 of retirement. That same drift from 60-40 to 70-30 now represents something materially different. Their income coverage depends on those income positions holding steady. A 10-point shift in allocation is no longer a number on a spreadsheet. It's a real change in how reliably they can fund the next 5 to 7 years. In that case, the rebalance has a clear job to do. Same math, completely different context. This is why debating rebalancing. Frequency is almost always the wrong conversation. The real question is this: at what threshold of drift specific to your portfolio and your life stage does your allocation actually change your risk profile? Some investors define that at 5 percentage points, some at 10. Some connected to a life event, a job change, a major withdrawal, a significant shift in income need. None of those approaches is wrong, but all of them share one thing. They are based on criteria, not on a calendar. The problem with calendar-based rebalancing is that it answers a question nobody actually asked. Your portfolio doesn't know it's a new quarter. The market doesn't care what month it is. Calendar rebalancing feels structured, but what it's actually doing is forcing a decision on a predetermined schedule rather than on a meaningful condition. And a decision made on schedule rather than on condition is not a judgment, it's a habit. Coming back to the original question, why don't I rebalance as often as most people expect? Because for most investors in the accumulation phase, the portfolio drifting is the portfolio working. A position that grew large because something is compounding. Cutting it back to restore a percentage that felt right 3 years ago isn't portfolio management. It's interference. There's also a practical cost to frequent. rebalancing that often goes undiscussed. In taxable accounts, trimming a position that has grown means realizing a gain. That gain gets taxed, and the money you hand to tax is money that no longer compounds. You pay a real price for restoring a percentage. The question is whether that restoration actually changes your risk profile enough to justify it. In many cases, especially in the accumulation phase, it doesn't. The math of frequent rebalancing often looks disciplined on paper, but it quietly erodes the very thing you're building. Picture an investor who started building a position in a broad equity ETF 5 years ago. At the time, it represented about 50% of their total portfolio. Today, because that position has performed well, it's closer to 65%. Their first instinct is to trim, because 65% feels like it crossed a line. But if they're still adding monthly and years from needing income, the growth is working as intended. The discomfort they feel is not a signal that the portfolio is wrong. It's a signal that the criteria haven't been checked recently. Those are very different problems with very different solutions. The criteria I actually use are simple. Has my risk profile changed? Has my income need changed? Has the original reason I held this position changed? If none of those are true, the portfolio isn't broken. It's just growing unevenly, which is exactly how long-term compounding works. There's a broader pattern worth naming here. The investors who rebalance most frequently are often the ones who feel least certain about their portfolio. That's understandable. Rebalancing creates the feeling of being in control, but certainty doesn't come from frequency of action. It comes from clarity of criteria. When your criteria are defined, the rebalancing decision changes completely, not because the market becomes more predictable, but because your response to the market becomes more predictable to you. You stop asking, should I rebalance right now? You start asking, has the condition that would require a rebalance been met? That's a very different question, and it produces a very different investor. The investor who rebalances rarely isn't doing so because they're not paying attention. They're doing it because they know exactly what they're watching for. They've defined the condition in advance. So when the market moves or when a position runs, the question is never, should I act? The question is, has my condition been met? Most of the time, the answer is simply, not yet. The criteria don't change with the market. That's the whole point. Compounding quietly. Slow, steady wealth building. If this helped, subscribe and leave a like. Everything here is for informational purposes only. All final decisions and responsibilities remain with you. Thanks for spending time with Compounding Quietly today.